Okay, my name is Kurt Wise. I'm talking about the sedimentology of the flood. Sedimentology is the study of the sediments of the world. Sediments are basically rocks made of, or a pile of pieces of other rocks. It can be anything from sand or sandstone made from it, or mud, or shale made from it, or carbonate mud and carbonate that's made from it. These are all sediments. So flood sedimentology would be the study of sediments formed in the flood. Sedimentology is a science. Flood sedimentology is a science. Now, optimally, what we want to do in creationism anyway, we believe that the first place we go on any science is to Scripture to find out what Scripture has to say about it. What did God say about this issue? That is our starting point. If we do that in the area of sedimentology, we realize that the Bible has, it seems to have very little to say about sedimentology itself. What it does say, it seems to say about flood. So that's important. We'll look at, for a few moments, what the Bible says about the flood that might be pertinent to sedimentology. The flood account begins in Genesis 7:11 with a comment that on the same day were all the fountains of the great deep over the whole earth broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and it's the opening salvo, if you wish, in the flood account. There appears to be something happening there. The breakup of the fountains of the great deep suggests that there's some very quick cataclysmic event that is worldwide. We suspect that it is impacting the crust of the earth, the hard rocks of the earth, in such a way that it's breaking up the entirety of the earth in some way or another. That's probably, if one thinks about it, going to result in sediments. Break up rocks, move rocks around, and you're going to produce sediment in the process. So there's an implication that we have sedimentology as a consequence of this, sediments as a consequence of this. Following that, in the same statement, we have a sequence of the reference to the fountains, the windows. We don't know for sure if they're causally listed causally, one's causing the other. But anyway, we have these phenomena called fountains and windows, which lead ultimately, does seem to be the cause of what follows, which is a description of a flood that transgresses onto the land, covers ultimately the mountains of the world, that this is the global flood referred to in Scripture. It's, according to that account, that flood remains high, keeping itself over the mountains for better than a year of time, approximately a year of time. And its purpose in the flood account is to destroy all humans and all animals that live on the land. And so it's an event. It says even in the account later that it would never happen again. God promised He would never do it again. So this is a one-time event in the history of the earth in the past that probably affected the floods, the earth's sediments, the rocks of the earth across the world. But the flood account, the Scripture doesn't directly refer to rocks, doesn't directly refer to sediments. We can only infer this. This is some of the very few things we learn in looking at the Bible about the sedimentology of the flood. So as a consequence, having looked at the Bible, we find very little on the topic. We're really forced to look at the rocks themselves to learn about the sedimentology of the flood. At the same time, we should never ignore the evidence from Scripture. As we go along, we might need to refer to Scripture again to check things out. Make sure all along the way that we're not diverging from the flood account or from the scriptural account or speculating on things that actually aren't allowed in the account. And in that regard, we have sediments on the present earth. So we might ask, how did these sediments come to be? Excuse me. Got that. We have sediments on the present earth. I'd ask, how'd they come to be? There's a possibility, given the creation account, that God might have created the sediments in place. So perhaps all the sediments on the earth, or a significant percentage of them, were formed in the creation week, and they weren't formed in something like a flood. So we need to look at the sediments of the earth to determine if there's a way to determine when they were created. One observation we find in many of the sediments of the earth is that they contain fossils, such as these wonderful trilobites. Especially animal fossils in particular is my interest at the moment, because animal fossils suggest that animals died to produce the fossils. But the biblical account strongly suggests that animal death did not precede the fall of man. That in fact, the death of animals is something that comes as a result of the curse that God instituted upon the earth in response to man's sin. And if that's the case, then it seems unlikely that the God who introduced death in response to man's sin would have created an earth before that had evidence of death before man's sin. In other words, it's unlikely that he created rocks with fossils in it, with evidence of death, if in fact he at the same time created an earth that wasn't supposed to have any animal death. So this suggests that the rocks that have animal fossils, anyway, the sediments that have animal fossils, were formed after the fall of man. So they weren't created by God in the creation week, they were formed sometime thereafter. Some of those sediments might well have been formed in the flood. So you need to now determine which of those sediments were in fact formed in the flood. So we're going to look at the major features, the sediments, really the major sediments of the earth, to determine where the flood was in their formation. We have something on this planet that geologists refer to as the lithostratigraphic column. Lithos is something meaning rock. Strata is referring to the layers of rock. The lithostratigraphic column is a column of layers of rock. Basically, the idea is if you of rocks there, it is a series of layers of rock, strata of lithos. So it's a lithostratigraphic column, if you wish. If you just took one section of it, one column of it, you'd have a pile of rocks there that make up a column. That would be a lithostratigraphic column of the Grand Canyon. We're here in Tennessee. Hypothetically, you could drill a hole down into the ground or dig a hole in such a way that you'd be able to discover the column of rocks that's below us, the layers of rock that are found from here to where you don't find any more layers of rock. You go to other places and that would be a lithostratigraphic column for, in this case, Dixon, Tennessee. Go to another location, you would find a column of rocks at that location. What we have done in geology is we have considered the lithostratigraphic columns from around the world, and we've compared them. Realize that there's some interesting features in those columns. There's a sequence of rocks in those columns which is found in all or most of those columns. This has caused us to conceptualize a theoretical column that contains all the components of the columns from all over the world, and that present a sequence of rocks in a particular order, with a kind of a fingerprint of a sequence of rocks that is unique. When you take that particular sequence of rocks and compare it to any real sequence of rocks, like in the Grand Canyon might be missing some of the rocks of the whole lithostratigraphic column, of the global lithostratigraphic column, but what rocks it contains are in the same order as this column that we find we've inferred globally. In fact, no matter where you go in the world, you'll find rocks in the same order as the global lithostratigraphic column. And really, in geology, those of us who had the opportunity to go from place to place and look at these things, really find this rather stunning. I grew up in Illinois, I became familiar with the lithostratigraphic column there in northern Illinois. And when I began in family trips to go to places like Florida and out west and so on and so forth, and began looking at the lithostratigraphic columns in those locations, even as a child, there were opportunities where I realized, wow, this is the same sequence of rocks that I'm seeing back in Illinois. This is the same sequence of rocks I remember seeing in Montana when I'm down in some other location, Grand Canyon or something like that. Then when I had opportunity to go to Australia, it was even more stunning. That was probably the most impressive. So the first time I really went significantly outside the United States, to actually walk up to a pile of rocks and be, if I didn't know anything else, never seen any part of Australia, didn't know where I was in Australia, saw the sequence of rocks, this looks very much like what I saw. I bet this is where I'm at in the lithostratigraphic column. Asked my friend Andrew Snelling, who lives in Australia, who I was visiting, and he'd say, well, yes, that's exactly where you're at. I'd say, that's amazing. Are you kidding? That's crazy. The same sequence of rocks. You go to England, and it's the same sequence there as we find in America. This is the consistency of this lithostratigraphic column is quite impressive indeed. Even though it might look like in detail, the colors, the rocks, and the way they're eroded might look different, the consistency of the lithostratigraphic column is truly impressive. This column has been introduced in the way that I just described, has been known, as I just described, for a couple centuries, at least 2 centuries. People have recognized the sequence of rocks and have recognized similarities from one country, one location to another. And this lithostratigraphic column has been in existence for longer, I'll put this parenthetical note in, it's been longer than people have known about evolution. This is before Darwin's theory of evolution. It was introduced. It's before radiometric dating was put on these rocks to determine their age. The lithostratigraphic column, an actual column of rocks, has been known for a very long time. The column is several thousand feet deep, thick, tall, however you want to look at it. In the middle of some of the continents, it's only a few thousand feet. Usually gets thicker as you get out towards the edge of the continents on either side. It averages better than a half mile in thickness around the world. When you look in detail at this, most of the column is made up of 3 rock types. About almost half of the column is made up of shale. Shale is made from mud, so it's lithified or rockified mud. So about half of it, again, is shale. About a fifth of it is carbonate, limestones, dolomites, things like that. And about 20% of it, another fifth of it are sandstone developed from sand grains that have been fused together into a rock. The lower part, and to look in a little more detail, we find that in the total pile, in the whole lithostratigraphic column from the world, the lowest rocks, not found everywhere, but when they're found consistently without fossils. Well, for a long time it was thought they had no fossils at all. In fact, they were called azoic, no life rocks. Beginning in the 1950s, people looked at these rocks under the microscope and realized that we could actually find bacterial fossils in them, but since bacteria are so small, you can't see them without the microscope. So it took that long before people recognized that there's any fossils at all. For our purposes here, there are no animal fossils at all in these rocks here. So the lowest rocks have no animal fossils. It's only after we get animals that we can be fairly certain that we're dealing with time after the fall and might be rocks formed in the flood. Now there are some interesting odd features in the sedimentary column, in the lithostratigraphic column. And what I mean by odd are rocks that they're either not formed in the present or they're rare in the present and turn out to be, in some places, very common in the lithostratigraphic column. So if you studied the present world and were familiar only with sediments formed in the present world, you might find the discovery of these kinds of things in the lithostratigraphic column rather odd. So they are odd features with respect to modern processes. And a few examples. In the rocks that are below the first animal fossils, we have an interesting group of rocks known as the banded iron formations, BIF for short. The BIF rocks are extremely unusual. We don't find BIFs formed in the present at all. In fact, people have argued for decades, centuries, how in the world the BIFs are formed. Very important rocks, it turns out, for 99.9% of the Earth's iron that's mined by humans comes out of the BIFs, or it comes out of things that eroded directly out of the BIFs. So there was a period in Earth history, and of course a pile of rocks here. The deepest rocks are thought to be the oldest rocks because once you have a rock in place, it's kind of hard to slip another rock underneath. So typically, if you see a lithostratigraphic column, you're going to think that the rocks on the bottom are older, the rocks on the top are probably younger. So there is this concept, and this is something sometimes I forget to share with people who are listening to me talk. Geologists, paleontologists have a weird way of looking at time. We often have time at the bottom of the page going forwards with the youngest stuff at the top and the oldest stuff at the bottom. But that's because that's what we see in the rocks. The rocks on the bottom are older and the rocks on the top are younger unless something really weird is going on. So the banded iron formations are in really old rocks compared to the other rocks of the world. So there seems to have been a time in Earth history, sometime in the past, early in the history of the Earth, where banded iron formations were formed. We don't even know how they were formed, what caused it, but it's a weird thing. And they don't seem to have formed after that. Now we go upwards into what we call the Devonian, and we encounter black shales. In fact, if you mention the phrase black shales to a geologist, he probably will immediately think of two levels in the lithostratigraphic column where many of the black shales are found. In the Devonian, and again, up further in the record in the Cretaceous. There are lots of black shales around the world at those particular locations. They're not unique to those. There are black shales found throughout the record, but in those particular levels, they're really, really thick. There's lots and lots of black shale. It's shale that is black in color, black because it's carrying a bunch of organic matter. In fact, in some cases, it's carrying so much organic matter that it transforms into oil or gas, and it's a source of a lot of our oil and gas. So there seems to be a couple of times in Earth history, at least, where there was an awful lot of production of black shale compared to other times. Going further up, we have a layer of phosphate formed, basically dumped out around the world. The Phosphoria Formation, for example, named because of so much phosphate in it. This is mineable phosphate. Most of the phosphate that's mined in the world is in fact mined from this particular location. It's not the only time that phosphate's found in the record. There are a couple other times where a good bit of it is formed, but this is a worldwide deposition of phosphate at one particular level. It seems very odd, at least in its abundance, how much of it is found. Immediately above that, we have what are called the Permo-Triassic sands. And in the Permo-Triassic layers around the world, we have these very thick sandstones, very thick sandstones. There's a sandstone sitting over Africa, for example. If you took all the sand of that one unit and put it on North America, making it all even the same thickness, it would be a kilometer thick over the entire continent of North America. There's a lot of sand in that one unit. The Permo-Triassic sands of Africa are huge, but there are Permo-Triassic sands in North America and in Europe and in Asia. very thick sandstones over most of the earth, if not all of the earth. It's really quite extraordinary. Why all that sand? In fact, in the case of the African material, a little bit of the top of that sandstone has been eroded off the top and blown around to produce the sand dunes of the Sahara Desert, covering North Africa. This is some amazing stuff. The same sand unit reaches up into the Middle East, and the treasury and the buildings of Petra are carved into the sand. It's the same sandstone that the Sphinx is carved into. It's an enormous sandstone deposit across Africa. Interesting. One period in Earth history where humongous amounts of sand deposited. Associated with it in similar layers, not in the same layer as the sandstone, but often immediately associated with it, we have red beds. These would be red shales, extensive over, again, all the earth. You have places in New Jersey with red shales. We've got places out west with red shales. We've got them on every continent. Why red shales at one time in Earth history in such abundance? They're found everywhere through the record in small amounts, but they're in humongous amounts. You move on up to the Cretaceous, it's well known for its chalk. The White Cliffs of Dover, for example. Hundreds of feet of chalk. Now, chalk is made of the little microscopic shells of microorganisms, single-celled organisms that create tiny little microscopic shells. How many microscopic shells does it take to make chalk? It used to be, back in the old days, in school, we had chalkboards where we had pieces of chalk that we would write on chalkboards with. We don't have that. We have a whiteboard here, for example. And it used to be kind of fun. I would like to do this every once in a while. I'd pick up a piece of chalk and just make a frivolous mark across the board. Woo! And I would point to that and say, hundreds of thousands of microorganisms gave their lives for that frivolous whiff of the chalk there. Just imagine how many shells it took to produce 100 feet of chalk covering most of the world. It's an astonishing amount of chalk in a particular layer in the column. Again, you find chalk at other places, but never as abundant as at that particular level. And here we have some photographs of banded iron formations. Pretty. It's alternating oxidation states of iron, so it alternates often between red, rusted iron, and black, which is anoxic iron. Very pretty stuff. The Sphinx, again, carved into the Permo-Triassic sands of Africa, the White Cliffs of Dover there in the Cretaceous. Just unusual rocks characterize the lithostratigraphic column. This immediately suggests, just this alone, suggests we have a history of the earth that's linear in nature. It is not cyclical. It's common in some Eastern religions. It's been common there's been individuals in the history of geology even that had the presupposition or the belief that Earth history is cyclical, that it's repetitive. Or there have been others, like Aristotle himself, who felt that Earth history was non-changing. It was always the same. But the lithostratigraphic column tells us, among other things, that the Earth has not been the same through its history. It's changed through time. And secondly, that it has not cycled. It has not started at one point, changed to something else, and come back to that same starting point again. It's a linear Earth history. Something that changes. It's not clear that it's degenerating or getting better or getting worse. It's changing. And it's linear in its change. And this is interesting because immediately it's consistent. We recognize the consistency with the biblical account, where God created the earth at one point in time. It's gone through history since then. There's an arrow to history. It's a linear history. It's not a cyclical history. It is going in one direction. So the lithostratigraphic column at the broadest view is one that indicates a linear history similar to that indicated in Scripture. Now, again, looking a little more closely at this, we recognize that there's a certain section of the rocks that contain animal fossils that, in fact, are in the fossils are in sediments that are found draped across entire continents. That the individual rock units, the sediments that we find the fossils in, can be traced not just across counties and states, but across regions and even continents. For example, I like to say that when I was living in Dayton, Tennessee, and I had the opportunity to do some caving in caves around there, I was doing caving in something called the St. Genevieve limestone. It was a name given to a particular limestone layer that in this pile of rocks is pretty close to the middle of this section, pretty close to the middle of the column. And if you step back away from the specific name and looked at the description of the rock, it was a cross-bedded oolitic pentremites-containing dolomite. You don't have to know what that means. It's just a very specific set of descriptors of the rock that narrowed the description down so that in Tennessee, where I was at, among this 30, 40, 50,000 feet of sediment that's in Tennessee, and it's interesting in Tennessee, it's laying in such a way at a little bit of an angle that the oldest sediment is exposed at the North Carolina border. And as you move to the west across Tennessee, if you drive to the west across Tennessee, you are actually going from the lower part of the lithostratigraphic column all the way up the column to the very youngest sediments in the Mississippi River. And so if you're looking for rocks of a particular age in Tennessee, you just drive to an appropriate position east-west in Tennessee and you can find rocks of that particular position in the lithostratigraphic column. And I was at a place in eastern Tennessee where it was at a cross-bedded oolitic pentremites-containing dolomite. That's a particular layer of rock that in 30, 40, 50,000 feet is very characteristic. There's no other rock like that. There's only one layer of rock, a couple hundred feet thick, that is a cross-bedded oolitic pentremites-containing dolomite. So it's very characteristic out of this entire pile. You go to Montana and look at the lithostratigraphic column in Montana, and they've got, again, 50,000 feet or so of sediment, and there's one layer in there that is a cross-bedded oolitic pentremites-containing dolomite, only one. Guess what? It's got caves in it. It's called the Madison limestone over there. It's got a different name, but it's got the same description. It's the same rock. Go down to Arizona to the Grand Canyon, and there's one rock in the tens of thousands of feet of sediment in the Grand Canyon. There's one rock that is a cross-bedded oolitic pentremites-containing dolomite. It's called the Redwall limestone, and it's got caves in it. So there you've got a unit that is found across the continent of North America. And it's even got caves in the unit where just about every place it's found. That's a sediment that is laid down across enormous extents. Now that's unlike the present. I could put it in here it's an odd feature because in the present world you find sediments formed in a lake for the extent of the lake. You find sediments downstream of a mountain on either side or on all sides of a mountain. As far as the rivers go away from the mountain, you don't find it across entire continents. You don't find sediments formed, especially underwater sediments, formed across entire continents. And so this is an interesting feature which suggests to me there's some sort of mechanism for laying down sediments across an entire continent, for blanketing an entire continent with sediments, especially water-laying sediments. It suggests there's water across the entire continent that laid down sediment across an entire continent. That's consistent with the idea of a global flood, which the Bible describes where water was over the entire continent. That could then deposit continent-wide sediments. In fact, I don't know any other way to do it. So I would suggest that the flood is actually then represented by the lithostratigraphic column in this extent. It's starting sometime after whatever formed these sediments down here. It ends at a certain point, and above that point, the sediments are no longer found across continents. They're found, in fact, as you go up there, they're found over smaller and smaller regions. Until now and today, we're finding it in very local areas, in individual lakes and ponds and streams and things like that. So this appears to be the area, the part of the lithostratigraphic column that's formed by the flood. So sedimentology of the flood would focus on this section of the lithostratigraphic column. If we look more closely at the rocks of the flood, then these would be flood fossils, these would be flood sediments. The sediments are consistently very thick, hundreds of feet thick. Again, that's in contrast to modern sediments, which might be inches to a few feet thick, maybe a score feet thick, but hundreds of feet thick is well outside the range of modern experience. Very uniform in composition. Here's the red wall limestone, for example, I was referring to in the Grand Canyon. It's over 800 feet thick, varies even up to over 1,000 feet thick in certain places. Very, very uniform in composition and spread, again, across the entire continent. And so we're talking about sediments that are deposited not just over a big area, but at big volumes. So something is producing them that's big. It's a big scale thing that is producing them, consistent with a global flood. In fact, these sediments are found across entire continents. Again, here's a drawing of the extent of the Sauk sandstone. Sandstone at the bottom of this pile of rock, flood rocks. Now, on this diagram, it's not the bright yellow stuff, it's the muted yellow stuff that is the extent of the Sauk. It's found up into the Arctic over most of the western United States, central and eastern United States. It's got a huge extent. It's across the entire North American continent, suggesting again that we've got a global, or at least a transcontinental event that is in fact depositing it. Here's another interesting thing. When you look at the rocks that are found across the continent, you find that there's a consistent east to west current direction. We can look at rocks and determine the direction. If you got water lane rocks, rocks that are dropped out of water, very often if it's moving water, it'll leave evidence of the moving water. For example, if the water is dragging objects on the bottom, it will leave drag marks. If in fact the water is moving fast enough to create dunes or ripples, it carries sand up one side of the dune, cascades it down the other side of the dune. It creates a series of what we call cross beds. The sand grains are in lines that cross across the normal flat orientation of the beds, and the direction of those cross beds indicates the direction of the current. So there's those and several other indicators will give us a clue as to the direction that the water was going. And Art Chadwick, beginning some decades ago, began checking PhD dissertations in geology departments in universities across first the United States and then went on to other countries for evidence in those dissertations of cross-bedding, of anything that indicated current directions. He went into dissertations because boring evidence like the direction that the current was going to go is not something you publish, and people don't publish every single observation they make. But graduate students record everything, hoping that collectively they're going to get something that is accepted as a thesis. So I was with them on one of these trips, went into a library, and we just sat down all day long, pulled theses off of the shelves, looked through them for descriptions of the rocks and descriptions of cross-bedding, and then wrote down the evidence, wrote down where it was located, the longitude, latitude, and then he's able to collect this data and at that particular longitude and latitude can put in an arrow indicating the direction of the current. Sometimes we even have something of an idea of the strength of the current at that particular location. And ultimately, he has collected more than 1 million data points of currents, the direction of currents in the production of sediments around the world. And what he finds interesting is that in sediments here beneath what we're calling flood sediments, the current directions are every which way. They don't go, and you've got some areas where it's facing east, some areas where it's facing west. There's no consistency to it. Likewise, in the youngest sediments above the flood sediments, we've got all sorts of different current directions. Or if you're looking in the United States, for example, you might find currents that go down the Mississippi River towards the Gulf, between the mountains, and then on the other side of the mountains, they would be running towards the ocean, which is the direction the water is going. So it either made some sense in terms of draining off of the continents, as we understand it, or they were just in every which way. But what he found in the sediments in between the youngest and the oldest, in the flood sediments, he finds consistent current directions over those things, which when you reconstruct the orientation of the continent at the time the continent was receiving the sediment, that it's actually running from the east to the west across the continents, across all the continents. So as the continents moved, as the continents rotated, it's still always going east to west. Really cool because sometimes it's even going through basins. There's bumps in the continent. For example, the Illinois where I grew up is an Illinois basin. There's a Michigan basin. These are huge dips in the geologic record among the sediments that indicates that there was a low area for some reason there. And it makes sense that in the low area, it should be the currents all go towards the center of the low area. But what his currents show is that while sediments were being deposited during that particular part of the lithostratigraphic column, the sediments have current directions that go up to the basin from the east to the west and go right through the basin from the east to the west. They go down the one side, which makes some sense, but it goes up the other side and out, consistently, just ignoring all of these features, as if there's a moving ocean over the continent, moving from east to west, depositing material consistently in that fashion. Interesting question as to why that might be. It's perhaps not a coincidence that if the moon holds water under it by its gravity, which it does in tides, and the earth spins underneath it, it would seem as if, because the moon would be holding the water in place, that the water would then move over the continent from the east to the west. So we suspect that this feature of east to west current direction is a consequence of the tidal effects of the moon during the flood. But the result of this is something very unusual, in the present anyway. It would be one of those unusual aspects of the flood sediments that is consistent with the idea, perhaps, of a global flood and nothing else. It certainly suggests moving water and a consistency in its direction. We also need to consider the issue of lamination. These sediments that are found in floods, in the flood rocks, are laminated, meaning they're finely layered. What is this, and what's the significance of that? Well, in the modern world, we just do not find laminated sediments, or extremely rare, Only certain instances do we find laminated sediments. In most sediments in the modern world, they are what we call bioturbated. The lamination is gone. And here's the idea is that there are organisms in the modern world that live on top of the sediment underneath the water. So you got water and then sediments down below it. There's critters that like to live right there, and they like to burrow into the sediment. They like to dig around in the sediment. They're looking for food in the sediment. Some of them are living in the sediment. Some of them are interacting with other organisms in the sediment. And what they do in digging through the sediment like that is they mix the sediment up. So if there were layers in the sediment when the sediment was originally laid down, these little guys will just destroy that layering. And they're very good at homogenizing or destroying the lamination of sediments. In fact, in the modern world, on beaches and ocean beaches, typically they will bioturbate sediments 30 or more feet down into those sediments. It's really quite extraordinary. In fact, one of my favorite things to do is when I go to the Geological Society of America meeting, where we have 2,000 papers presented in 4 days by geologists all over the United States coming together to share their ideas. I love what I call the hurricane papers. They don't always have them. I look for them, but they don't always have them. Used to be a little more common in the past. I haven't seen them in a few years now. But here's the idea of a hurricane paper. There's some graduate student who is in biology. He's studying critters. He's a marine biologist. He wants to study marine organisms. Even better, he wants to study marine organisms on his favorite beach, right? So he has his favorite beach. He then goes out on the offshore in the water there and finds a community of organisms that he thinks hasn't been sufficiently studied. He hopes it hasn't been sufficiently studied. And he determines to do his dissertation studying that community of organisms. So he goes out there and snorkels his way or skin dives or whatever down to the bottom there, lays out a grid defining the community he's going to study, and he comes back, and he has to come back now. You got to take years to do this. You got to keep coming back to that same beach. It's just laborious stuff. You got to come back to the same beach. You got to go back to the same place. You got to dive down. I mean, you have to do this. You got to dive down there. You got to look at all those little critters. You go down there and you first of all you figure out where everyone is. You give them all names. You identify where they're at in your grid. And you come back the next year and see who's moved and who's had babies, and you're studying a community over 3 or 4 years. But alas, every once in a while, one of these poor souls has chosen a beach that just before he finishes his work, a hurricane comes in and lands on that beach. It takes the sand of the beach and takes it out and dumps it on top of his community. Covers his community with 5-6 feet of sand. Whoomp. It's all gone. It's like, and so there he is. He's got this dilemma. Now what do I do? Let's see. Option number 1. Go jump off a bridge. Now, we'll try not to do that, okay? How do I do this? Well, I guess one possibility is give up and start over again. Find another beach and do that. But I've already spent 3 years at this. You don't want to do that. So you think, well, is there another way to deal with this? Okay, I'm going to give up and go into English or something. Let's not do that. Here's an idea. How about if we turn our project from a study of a community under normal circumstances to the recovery of a biological community from an ecological catastrophe, from the recovery of a biological community from a hurricane? This is great. So we can go out and use GPS and put our markers down as close as we can to where they were before, some 5 feet down from its present location. And now it might extend our study a little bit, but we're insistent on seeing if we can watch how the community recovers. And what's cool about, and these are what I call the hurricane talks. The hurricane talks are so cool because every one of them turns out the same way. Within 1 year of the hurricane having come in and left 3 to 5 feet of sand over that region, 1 year later, there is no evidence that the hurricane ever was there. You've got a community that has recovered, that has come back to the surface. It's dug down into the sediment and homogenized the sand with the mud underneath. Reached down 30 feet down, so homogenized it that you can't tell, you can't even identify this huge sand layer. And the community is perfectly happy as if nothing ever happened. It's really cool. Organisms are extraordinarily efficient at destroying the lamination that might have been there when the sediments were formed. And so in the modern world, because there are burrowers that burrow into the sediment and there's time there for them to burrow, it destroys any lamination, and it results in what we call bioturbated living turbulence of the sediments by organisms. If you see laminated sediments with nice layers in there, it must mean there are either no burrowers or there's no time for burrowing. For example, in the Dead Sea, there are laminated sediments underneath the Dead Sea. Why are there laminated sediments underneath the Dead Sea? It's called the Dead Sea because there's no critters there burrowing into the sediment. So it doesn't matter how long it's been, there's lamination. So when you find lamination, you can deduce that either you don't have burrowers or there's not been time for burrowing. What you find in these flood sediments, and there's thousands of feet of flood sediments, is they're almost all laminated. It's hard to find a bioturbated sediment. So what's going on here? Does that mean there are no burrowers or that there's no time? Well, in these same sediments, we find fossils of the burrowers. We find lots of fossils of the burrowers. They're there, at least they died there. That suggests it isn't because there are no burrowers. It must be then that there's just not enough time for them to bioturbate the sediment. So we have rapid deposition of these sediments and into layers, and we just are doing it so fast that the little critters might be able to make individual little burrows, and we do see those, but they can't spend enough time there to bioturbate the sediment before they get buried too deep and they asphyxiate under those circumstances. So we apparently have extremely rapid deposition in this. Another observation from these flood sediments are something we call mega sequences. I have to first explain what a sequence is. In geology, a sequence is a pile or package of rocks, sedimentary rocks, that is bounded below and above by erosional surfaces. So it's a stack of sediments. I got them represented over here. And the base of the sediment, you have evidence of erosion. We have sediments underneath these that have been cut into in some way or otherwise giving us evidence of erosion or a period of time where there's no deposition. Likewise, at the top of the sedimentary pile, we have further evidence of erosion. It would be the base of the next, let's say, sequence of sediments. So first of all, it's a package of sediments with erosion surfaces above and below, but that's not enough. That's not the whole definition. Sequence also says something about the particular sequence of rocks, sediments, that is deposited therein. The order is important. You might be missing one or two of these, but even if you're missing some, they're always in the same order. If you have a complete sequence, you have the rocks at the base of the sequence, the sediments at the base, are made of big particles. That's a conglomerate. It might be a gravel, it might even be bigger, it might be boulder bed, it might be a cobble bed, it might be a mega boulder bed. But it'll have the biggest sedimentary particles are in the lowest layer. As you move upward, the particles making up the sediment decrease in size. So you go from a conglomerate to a sandstone. You go to a coarse sandstone and then to a finer and finer sandstone. And eventually you get to a siltstone, and eventually you lose all of the larger particles and you're left only with the tiny little particles of clay. 50, 60, 70 micron sized particles of clay. And then finally, way at the top of the sequence, you don't have clay, you have carbonate, which is limestone or dolomite or something like that. So this sequence is a fining upward sequence. Conglomerate, sandstone, shale, carbonate, the size of the particles is decreasing as we go up. Now a sequence then, if we see a sequence, it tells us, it's sort of, you're automatic in your training to see a sequence and go, oh, well, I can explain that. A fining upward sequence, it means that this is a single sedimentary package, a single unit that's deposited in one event. The event is water that is decreasing in speed with time. So water initially, at the bottom here, is moving so fast that it can carry everything. It can carry the boulders, it can carry the gravel, it can carry the sand, it can carry the mud, it can carry the carbonate. It carries everything. It can't even drop anything because it's moving so fast. But it's not only moving fast, since it's also carrying all this abrasive material, it can also erode. It can cut into the sediments underneath and create that erosion surface. As the water slows down, it gets to a point where it can no longer erode and in fact starts dropping out its stuff. It first drops out the big stuff. It drops off the boulders, and then as it slows down further, it drops out the cobbles. As it slows down even further, it drops out the gravel, then the sand, then the silt, and then the shale. So what it's doing is it's a single depositional event, one surge of water that's very fast and then slows down, depositing a sequence. Okay, that's somewhat logical. It's what we observe, even right now in floods and so on and so forth. What we find in the flood sediments, between those that have no animal fossils and these up here that are after the flood, we find what we call mega sequences. These are sequences of rocks that aren't just, let's say, a few feet thick. They're hundreds of feet thick, even in some cases nigh on 2,000 or several thousand feet thick. So for example, starting here at the base of these flood sediments, we have something called the Sauk mega sequence. These are named after Indian tribes. And this was first discovered in North America by an oil company employee, last name of Sloss, so these are called Sloss's megasequences. And in this diagram, which is off of Sloss's work directly, the right side of the diagram corresponds to the eastern North American shore. The western shore is represented on the left. In those locations, we have very thick sedimentary units. In this diagram, those things that are orange here are places where there's no rock known. The places that are in blue are the rock that is known. So the Sauk megasequence is very thick in the eastern United States. It's very thick on the western United States. It's very thin halfway in between, in the mid-continent. So we have a sequence of rocks, very thick on the coasts and thins to the center of the continent, that is again a sequence. Think of this, the base of it is an erosional surface. The top of it is an erosional surface. It starts with conglomerates and sandstones, goes into shales and carbonates at the top. Then, on top of that, there's another one called the Tippecanoe. Again, thick at the coast, thins to the middle. It's again a sequence. Kaskaskia is the next one, Absaroka is the next, Zuni is the next. Some people claim that there's a Tejas above it, but it's violating the rules of sequence because there's no erosional boundary on the top, and it's not a complete sequence. And in fact, it isn't a sequence at all. It doesn't have conglomerate with sandstone and shale sequence. It's a bunch of different kinds of rocks. So actually, the Tejas is not a sequence at all. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 distinct mega sequences in North America. Now, again, this is a mind-boggling concept here. If, in fact, a sequence is a single depositional event, it's a single with one surge of water with high velocity at the beginning and decreasing velocity with time, we have evidence here of 5 humongous surges of water. 5 humongous, I mean, depositing hundreds of feet of sediment, crossing the entire continent of North America, depositing sediment of that on that magnitude across the continent. What I've got here is a map from a whole series of maps that were produced by the Correlation of Stratigraphic Units of North America project. They shorten it to the Kasuna project. So this is one of the charts, the Kasuna charts from that project. And this is a region of North America represented on this chart, which is a North Appalachian region. What they've done is they have a series of stratigraphic columns. So right here is one stratigraphic column from the bottom, the oldest rocks, all the way up to the youngest rocks. Here's another column, a lithostratigraphic column from the youngest to the from the oldest to the youngest, and so on. We have several dozen columns up the Appalachian Mountains from the, I believe the numbers, I can't even read them on here, but I think the numbers run from southwestern Appalachian Mountains all the way up to the northeastern portion of the northern Appalachians. And so we're sticking columns side by side, and so we're able to see features, able to compare columns from one place to another over a region. There's a bunch of maps, there's a dozen or so such maps that cover North America. So if we had them all, and each map is like 4 feet by 3 feet, and if you laid them out, you'd need a big room here to lay them all out to kind of see the pattern. But it is a cool pattern when you see it. I've scaled this one. I've taken the picture of the chart and scaled it down to where we see the mega sequences. Fortunately on this chart, the other thing's cool about it, every time they've got a carbonate rock, they made it blue. Every time they had a shale rock, encountered a shale rock, they made it a gray color. Every time they encountered a sandstone, they made it yellow, and they made the conglomerates orange. So a brief, and I know it can't be, you can't see this too well on the diagram here. It's much better in real life, but what I think you might be able to see some of the patterns here. What you have from here to here is a bunch of blue. And that's the top, top of a sequence. At the base down here, you have a little bit of yellow, and there's a little bit of orange. So we have the sequence of orange to yellow. It's a tiny bit of gray, and then a whole bunch of blue. Then we have a bunch of orange, bunch of yellow, gray, and blue again. And then we have yellow, don't see much orange, but we have gray, and then blue again. And then we have a bunch of orange, then we have yellow, and we have blue again. We see the repeating sequence of orange, which is conglomerate, then sandstone, then shale, then carbonate. And so these sequences, the Sauk sequence is found right across here. The Tippecanoe sequence is found right across here. The Kaskaskia is found here. The Absaroka, all we have are the conglomerates of the Absaroka. We don't have the remainder of it, at least in this portion of North America. At the base of these megasequences is something known as the Great Unconformity. The base of the lowest megasequence, which is the Sauk, is the Great Unconformity. Here we see it in Grand Canyon. We got sediments below the Great Unconformity coming in at an angle with respect to the sediments that are above the Unconformity. Here's the Great Unconformity, and perhaps you can see, let me go back and forth between where the line is. You got the sediments of the flood up here and sediments of the pre-flood down below it. The Sauk megasequence then is this first set of sediments here in the Grand Canyon. If we look more closely at the Great Unconformity, we have this extraordinary surface in the Grand Canyon, extraordinarily flat over a humongous distance. Oh, there are some highs and lows. There are some highs, for example, in the place where the rocks underneath the Great Unconformity really hard. There's something called the Shinemu quartzite, which is a really, really, really hard rock. And over that rock, the Great Unconformity comes up about 300 feet. And then downstream, again, we can tell current direction, downstream from the high point, there are chunks of Shinemu quartzite that are 40, 50 feet in diameter. Boulders that have been ripped off the top of the Shinemu and deposited downstream in the base of the Sauk megasequence. It's awesome stuff. But if it isn't, if you're not over a really, really hard rock, the Great Unconformity is as smooth, flat as you could possibly imagine over not just the distance of the Grand Canyon, which is a couple hundred miles, but across the entire North American continent. Think of this, the Sauk megasequence is this surge of water that has enough power to rip maybe thousands of feet of sediment off of the North American continent, shaving it flat over the width of the continent. And then as the water eased up, it dropped out first boulders that are 50 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet in diameter, and then smaller boulders, and then gravel, and then sand, and then shale, and finally carbonate to come after that. It's an amazing thing to think of what kind of power was involved to produce this phenomenon known as a megasequence. That suggests that during the flood there were 5, at least in North America, 5 pulses of sedimentation of almost incomprehensible power across North America. Another observation, each of these megasequences is capped by carbonate. I've implied that the sediment of the sequence is made up of particles smaller and smaller as you go up. And the carbonate at the top has the smallest particles of all, and that makes them really interesting because the carbonate in the top of the megasequences of the flood is micritic, meaning it's made of particles that are micron-sized. A micron is a millionth of a meter. It's the size of a bacterium. Our cells are tens of microns in size. They're microscopic, but they're huge compared to micron-sized bacteria. This is a carbonate made of micron-sized particles. Say, so what? Well, the thing is, in the modern world, almost all the carbonate that's produced, the limestone, the dolomite, that sort of thing that's produced in the modern world, is made of larger particles than that. They're not micron-sized, they're millimeter-sized or bigger. There's probably better than 98% of all the carbonate in the world is formed producing much larger particles than micron-sized. How do you get micron-sized carbonate? Actually, in the modern world, we do produce a micron-sized carbonate in a very rare instances. And in every case, it's formed by micron-sized critters. It's formed by bacteria. Bacteria precipitate out particles of calcium carbonate and calcium magnesium carbonate, dolomite, that's the size of the bacteria that are micron-sized. But in the modern world, this is found in really small places where you got lots and lots of bacteria. This is just not a normal phenomenon. And besides, when a carbonate is recrystallized, which often happens, recrystallization increases the crystal size. So we don't know of any way to precipitate out such small particles without doing it with bacteria. In addition, when I went through geology classes, they said the carbonate was actually made not by precipitation out of the water most of the time, but by crunching up the shells of macrofossils, of macroorganisms, the shells of clams and snails and things like that. And truly, those shells are made of calcium carbonate. They're made of carbonate. But when you grind them up, you cannot grind them to a micron size, especially underwater. Ever tried to fight somebody underwater? I mean, it's something about you're fighting your way through, and when you finally hit them, it's like, I didn't really hit them. I mean, you can't put the power into it. And you really, this is where if you got kids that are, misbehaving and they want to beat each other up, put them in the pool and say they got to fight underwater. That'll wear them out. They probably won't hurt each other very well either, unless they drown each other. But the thing is that in water, you can't crush things to a micron size. So there's no way to take shells of organisms and make macritic carbonate from it. So the only way we know to produce macritic carbonate is by microorganisms. But I said that the carbonate of the lithostratigraphic column amounts to better than 1/5 of all of the rocks. In places it's thousands of feet thick. What? This is weird. Carbonate produced in this fashion must be a process very unlike the present. It's as if there was an enormous number of bacteria that would be necessary to produce such carbonate, a bacterial bloom. And I think that's what happened during the flood. Now, the flood was not a good place for humans. You just didn't want to be there unless you were on the ark. But if you're not on the ark, it's a bad place to be a dinosaur, to be a human, to be on the land, or just about anywhere on the planet. But if you're a bacterium, the flood might be a great place to be. During the flood, the water is warming up because it's being heated up by magma during the course of the flood. There's a bunch of humans, lots of humans that are being ground up by the flood, and their bodies are floating around, lots of food, nutrients. There's all these animals and plants, all those nutrients. There's volcanoes blowing their tops and dropping all sorts of nutrients in the water. Oh my word, the flood might be like the perfect place to be a bacterium. And so in the midst of the flood, while most things we're familiar with are dying and disparaging, the bacteria go, wee-yippee, and they take off, and algal blooms or bacterial blooms might actually, this unbelievable bacterial blooms might actually be responsible for precipitating hundreds, in some cases thousands of feet of micritic carbonate. There's really no other way to explain that carbonate than in the course of the flood. So it turns out the carbonate is not just a normal sediment of the lithostratigraphic column. It is, again, odd structures, odd sediment, probably only producible in the course of a flood. In addition, if we look back at some of these things I've mentioned before, there's good reason to believe that the banded iron formations are produced by bacteria as well. Don't have time to get into the rationale here, but there seems to be a point in Earth history when a whole bunch of bacteria, perhaps blooms of bacteria in the creation week, maybe, actually generated the banded iron formations. If we look at the black shales, what makes the shales black? It's organic matter. Where's the organic matter coming from? I think it's very possible that the organic matter is coming from blooms of bacteria. In this case, they're actually associated with what I believe are floating forests during the flood. They're underneath the floating forest in anoxic regions, lacking oxygen. Underneath the floating forest, I believe there's algal blooms that are occurring there, and the bodies of the bacteria literally are living and then dying and falling to the bottom. And because it's anoxic, they're not being decomposed, not being broken down. They're just collected on the bottom. In the mud, you got a bunch of, I can't say billions because it's far beyond that, quadrillions. It's how many bacteria we're talking about mixed in with the flood to leave us with black shales. Also, way up there in the Cretaceous chalk, the chalk itself are the shells of microorganisms, not bacteria. These are bigger critters, but nonetheless single-celled organisms that are it's very thick accumulations. It would be an algal bloom in that case, a bloom of algae, eukaryotic algae, that is taking advantage again of the nutrients of the flood to prosper. And then perhaps our black shales that are associated with the chalks. What an incredible contrast. We've got these bright white chalks, and we got these very dark, almost black shales, very often in juxtaposition of each other. What's going on with the black shales? Well, if in the algal blooms, what often happens is the algae will take all the oxygen out of the water in the midst of their bloom, creating an anoxic, lack of oxygen situation, which often kills fish, kills other organisms that have to breathe, that need the oxygen in the water to breathe. But under those circumstances, the bacteria that don't need the oxygen to breathe, they can live in anoxic conditions, will thrive in the presence of all of the food that the organisms producing the chalk generate. So the chalk would have an algal bloom at the surface, and which would anoxify, take the oxygen out of the water underneath, and the bacteria would respond by blooming in response, and they would rain a black organic matter on the material at depth to produce black shales. And so it may in fact be that the flood in particular gives us the mechanism to explain the unusual sediments that otherwise are not explainable in terms of modern normal processes. And I have to add one other interesting bit of research to this, the research done by Steve Austin in the Grand Canyon, more specifically in the Redwall limestone, which I referred to earlier in the canyon. He started this research in a place called Nautiloid Canyon, a tiny little side canyon to the main canyon of the river, which was named after a set of fossils, nautiloids, found in that canyon. Here's a picture from Steve's repertoire of pictures of one of these nautiloids. He's got his compass there for comparison, for size comparison and so on. These are shells, cone-shaped shells that average about 3 feet long. They're cone-shaped. They start from 5-6 inches in diameter, typically go down to a very, not completely sharp, but nearly sharp tip. They have chambers in the shell. The organism lives in the biggest chamber on the big end of the shell, has an extension of its body which goes through a hole which runs through the middle of the shell. So the organism is able, and it looks like a squid. It's a squid-like organism that lives in there. So it's an animal with arms, with eyes, and what it's able to do in the shell is it's able to pump water into the chambers or air into the chambers, kind of like a submarine works, so that it can adjust its position in the water column. It's a carnivore. It goes after other organisms, swimming after other organisms. Here's an attempt at a reconstruction of the nautiloid, long cone-shaped shell with a head, eye, many arms. It kind of looks like an octopus at one end or a squid at one end. This is a nautiloid. In this particular bed, there's a bunch of nautiloids preserved in one bedding plane. Here's the little creek in Nautiloid Canyon has eroded a flat surface through the Redwall limestone. Each place you got a piece of paper here. We're noting the location of a nautiloid. And here I am sitting next to Steve there. We're studying the nautiloids in Nautiloid Canyon. And here's a part of a drawing, a map we made of the location of the nautiloids in Nautiloid Canyon with their orientations. There's a tendency for them in one portion, at least one portion of the canyon, for them to be kind of lined up in the same kind of area. Now most of them are sitting, well, a majority of them are sitting in a horizontal position, but there's a few like these which actually show up as round circles because the shell is not laying down, but is actually vertical. And you're looking straight down on the shell, which is coming out of the limestone. It's been eroded away on the top, so all you see is a circle. This is an odd thing. You might expect that shells might get collected on a surface and lay down horizontally on a surface, but you wouldn't expect the shells to be sitting vertically and to wait for sediment to gradually accumulate, especially since, according to the conventional wisdom, this limestone or dolomite is actually generated at only about 6 inches per 1,000 years. So it's going to take a very long time to bury these puppies. It's even going to take longer if these guys are sitting vertically, much longer than they could survive. In addition, and not only did we study the nautiloids in Nautiloid Canyon, but Steve began following the layer they were found in. It was found by others in the 1960s, but Steve followed the layer to other places in the canyon, realized that it's not just found where it had been previously published, but it's found everywhere that particular layer is exposed. In fact, along the 200 miles of the Grand Canyon itself, plus over into Lake Mead and on into Las Vegas and into the hills over Las Vegas, he's found nautiloids over this entire distance, which is it's about probably, I'm going to guess, 350 miles or so. Lots of nautiloids. Probably, if you think about the total extent of this thing, it's probably billions of nautiloids over this extent. They're found in a particular layer that's about 6 feet thick. Here's Steve, he's about 6 feet tall. So you can see a rather distinctive layer in the midst of the Redwall. And the fossils are found in the middle of that layer. Got 3 feet above and 3 feet below, it's got no fossils. It's just got the carbonate, the macritic carbonate, and the fossils are restricted to the middle zone. This is a really weird thing. We're used to things like, like the sequence of rocks a water pulse will drop the heavy stuff and then lighter stuff, so things go from big to little. We're used to that. That's called normal bedding, as a matter of fact, normal graded bedding. And there are weird situations where we can get it to go from fine to coarse, but how do you get a coarse in the middle and nothing, no fossils on the upper and lower part. And that was what Steve was interested, it's the question Steve was interested in answering, and ultimately came to understand that the way you do this is with an underwater gravitational flow deposit, basically an underwater avalanche. Now it has to be underwater, and I'll try to explain why that is. If you've got a mass, a debris flow of some sort, you got mud plus the stuff in it that's moving across a surface. The surface isn't moving, the mud is moving. Right where the mud is going across the surface, the mud is obviously slowed down by the fact that the bottom isn't moving. So the bottom layers of mud are moving slower than the layers above it. If there's a velocity profile, the mud at the very bottom isn't moving at all, and then the mud as you move up into the mud is moving faster the farther you move up into the mud. There gets a point just above the base somewhere where the speed of all of the mud is going at the same rate. But what happens then is if there happens to be a fossil, an organism that's stuck in that zone of shear, that zone where there's different speeds of mud, the fossil will get turned and will get rotated out of that zone, at least if the mud flow goes far enough. If the mud flow goes far enough, it rotates the thing out of the middle zone, out of the lower zone, towards the middle of the deposit. And so that's how you get rid of all the fossils in the bottom part. Now, if the flow is in the air, it's coming off of a mountain or something, and it's exposed at the top to the air, there's almost no shear between the top of the unit and the air itself. And so the velocity of the mud is pretty much the same all the way to the top of the unit. Fossils will remain in the top of the unit. But if it's not air above it, but water, more specifically heavy water in the sense that it's deep water, if the water is deep enough, it's pressing down on the top of this flow sufficiently that it causes the top of the flow to again have a zero velocity at the top of the flow and increased velocity towards the center of the flow. Once again, fossils then in the top of the unit get rotated towards the middle, and you end up with, when this thing finally stops, if it's gone far enough, and if it's under enough water, it's going to end up with a situation with no fossils on the top, no fossils on the bottom, all the fossils oriented in the middle, and because the fossils have been rotated into that central position, a bunch of them are going to be vertical, not horizontal. You're going to get a mixture of horizontal and vertical fossils in the middle of this unit. This is characteristic of an underwater, deep underwater, flow of clastic flow underwater. So the only way to really interpret the nautiloid bed, this bed with the nautiloids in it, is that there's an underwater landslide deposit that ran along the bottom of a deep deep water. In this case, it's the ocean over the land. It's in the middle of the flood. And the direction of flow indicates that it came somewhere from the east, ran across what is now Grand Canyon. And it's really interesting, this stuff out here in Las Vegas shows a place where it finally loses its energy. It stays 6 feet thick through this entire region of the Grand Canyon, which suggests that this stuff is probably on a very thin film hydroplaning for most of the distance through the Grand Canyon, probably moving at 100 miles an hour through underneath the water here before it finally loses its hydroplaning characteristics and then breaks up, kind of blows up on the far side. Where does it come from? We don't know, but it could be hundreds of miles away from here. So what we have here is a unit. Here we see it from the air. Here's the nautiloid bed in the midst of other beds of the red wall. It's 6 feet of carbonate that was deposited in seconds. It's coming along so fast. And so the conventional wisdom, again, is that carbonate is formed 6 inches per 1,000 years. So we've got 6 feet of carbonate that would traditionally be understood to be, 12,000 years of deposition of carbonate. And it's done in seconds, minutes at the most. But if you back up and look at the rest of the red wall, that's not the only unit that looks like that. That might be the only unit with big old fossils in the middle, with the nautiloids in the middle, the only one that caught the nautiloids somehow, a whole group of nautiloids, a population of nautiloids. But many of these units have the same characteristics, the same thickness, and it suggests that maybe this isn't the only layer that's deposited in this fashion. So he was suggesting that similar flows might be responsible for most of the deposition of the carbonate. Carbonate is generated from carbonate mud. So if he extrapolates this from carbonate mud to other types of mud, remember that's almost 50% of the fossil record. The carbonate's 22% of the fossil record, the lithostratigraphic column. If you add these two things up together, nigh unto 3/4 of all of the rocks in the lithostratigraphic column might actually be deposited in this sort of fashion, with these underwater debris flows shot into place very quickly. We're producing hundreds, thousands of feet of this material very rapidly. So the combination of the critters that are very rapidly producing carbonate mud, which is then being shot laterally and accumulated in very quickly in many layers, would suggest that we could probably produce the 3/4 of the lithostratigraphic column in the matter of, and almost have to do it that quickly, in the matter of days, weeks, months at the most. What about the sandstone? Well, we're working on the sandstone. There are sandstone units people have argued aren't made underwater, like the Coconino sandstone of Grand Canyon, but the evidence for underwater formation of the sandstone is profound. Most of this sandstone is, like the Permo-Triassic sandstones, are highly cross-bedded, which suggests that they're formed very quickly by moving water. The evidence is that they're formed underwater, and some of those in the Grand Canyon, for example, have 90-foot-high crossbeds, which suggests that the dunes that's from are twice that high, 200-foot dunes. Not just dunes, but actually when you look at the three-dimensional geometry, these are not dunes, these are sand waves. Sand waves is a particular bed form that's only formed underwater. Modern sand waves, the biggest ones we know of, are formed under this the bridge in San Francisco Bay Bridge, by water that comes in during high tide and comes in high volume. Then as the water recedes, it has to come out through a narrow inlet to get back to the ocean. And so water is speeded up underneath the bridge very, very fast, producing very large sand waves that are about 3 feet high. That's the biggest sand waves we know of in the present world. Here in the Grand Canyon, we have sand waves that would be 200 feet high. That requires a water depth 5 times that, which is 1,000 feet of water. You've got to have 1,000 feet of water moving at several meters per second over an extensive area, basically all of the western United States, to explain these crazy Permo-Triassic sands, and the same with the sands that we find across Africa and so on. So we're not just talking about water sitting over the continents. They're moving at a very, very fast pace to produce the structures we have. So it very well could be, I think we're very close to arguing that the only way we can explain 98% of the lithostratigraphic column of what we understand to be flood sediments is in fact in a global flood. Even things like the phosphate, phosphate is formed in the present world in places called upwelling, where water from ocean depth comes up towards the surface. It's formed by a certain type of circulation of the water that brings those nutrients up. And it suggests that during the flood, to have a global distribution of phosphate means that we've got some global recirculation of water from the ocean depths, bringing up nutrients from to the surface around the globe, which really can't be explained by anything other than a global flood. Another observation, last observation I think I'm going to make here, is that from the base of these flood sediments up to the Permo-Triassic sands, we have fossil evidence that indicates that these are all marine sediments, all formed from marine sources, meaning, in other words, it's not just that they're deposited in marine conditions, the sediments are coming from what were formerly ocean positions and carried to where they are now. Now there are some terrestrial fossils found in here, but I've reinterpreted them as being part of a floating forest, a forest floating on top of the oceans. So technically, all of this is apparently entirely marine. So, and then it's only after this that we get evidence of true terrestriality mixed in with the marine. So it would appear that this event, this flood event, was first of all a marine event, burying things in the ocean only, and then moved onto the land to bury things on the land. And it very well could be then that the Permo-Triassic sands are the transgressing waters of the flood, picking up the sand dunes of the world's beaches and taking them and spreading them across the planet. And then subsequently burying the critters that are found on the land. So the processes responsible for the major features of the Earth's lithostratigraphic column are global, they're brought about by water, and it is a true catastrophe. Catastrophe meaning it's something that happened very fast, very big scale, and also we usually think destructive as well. These are things that are best explained as being part of the flood, being part of the result of God's judgment on human sin that came to the earth in the days of Noah. There's really, I think in the end, there's going to be no other way to explain the major features of the lithostratigraphic column than by this mechanism. So we have here extraordinary evidence of God's response to human sin. God does not take human sin lightly. It is a serious issue. I think we seriously we want to think that we're not that bad, but in fact, when you see our unrighteousness compared to the righteousness of God, His holiness is so awesome that it justifies the incredible power, horror of the judgment that God leashed upon this planet at the time of Noah. Thank you.